The silence came first, not the silence of empty space or the silence of a chamber waiting to be filled. This was the silence of 300 beings who had just understood, simultaneously, that something was standing in the room with them that they had not given permission to enter. Ambassador Vel Sareth felt it before he saw it, a pressure change in the atmospheric processors. A flicker in the thermal readings along the western wall of the Auric Court, the great ceremonial chamber at the heart of Throne Station Primarch, where the hegemony of consolidated races had held dominion over 43 civilizations for 600 years. His secondary sensory organs caught the displacement half a second before the optic array resolved the shape, and in that half second, Vel Sareth experienced something he had not felt since early childhood. He experienced uncertainty about whether he was going to survive the next few minutes. The warship was not large by galactic standards. That was the first thing that struck him, and then immediately confused him because the thought should have been reassuring. It was not. The vessel sat in the precise geometric center of the court's upper ceremonial space, a volume of air that had been designated, by 6 centuries of hegemony law, as inviolate, sacred, and physically inaccessible to any craft not bearing the Emperor's personal transit seal. The transit seal that no human vessel had ever been granted. The transit seal that required 17 separate authorization codes, biological confirmation from 3 senior council members, and most critically, the deactivation of a suppression field that surrounded Throne Station Primarch in a sphere 20,000 kilometers across. A suppression field that was, as of 8 minutes ago, still active. Vel Sareth stared at the vessel floating silently in Emperor Vosketh's ceremonial chamber and tried to understand how something could be inside a barrier that was still, according to every sensor array available to the hegemony, fully operational. And then he noticed the human standing below the ship's hull, on the polished floor of the Auric Court itself, and he realized that whatever question he had just formed was almost certainly the wrong question. The human was a woman. She appeared young by human reckoning, or at least, Vel Sareth understood that was how her species' aging process expressed itself outwardly, though hegemony xenobiological files had already taught him not to trust human surface characteristics. She was wearing a uniform he didn't immediately recognize, not the diplomatic gray-white that humanity's official delegates wore in galactic forums, not the dark utility suits of their merchant marine. This was something older in its design, structured, layered with a certain severity to the cut that implied it had been designed not for formal appearances, but for sustained operation in hostile environments. She was standing with her hands clasped loosely behind her back, looking upward at the vaulted ceiling of the Auric Court with what, in a human face, he had been trained to read as quiet contemplation. She was not afraid. That was the second thing that disturbed him. The first had been the ship inside an active suppression field. The second was that the human below it showed no physiological markers of stress, no elevated respiration, no tension posture, no scanning behavior suggesting she was assessing threats or exits. She looked like someone who had arrived early to an appointment and was simply waiting. Vel Sareth processed his briefing files in the seconds that followed. Humans had been permitted a limited diplomatic presence in hegemony space for 11 years. They had been granted observer status at the Council of 62 following the Vethara Accord, not full membership, not speaking rights on binding resolutions, simply the privilege of being present when decisions that affected them were made. It was a concession that several senior council members had argued against, and that Emperor Vosketh had approved with the particular disinterest he reserved for species he considered categorically non-threatening. The humans had accepted observer status without protest, without negotiation, without the lengthy procedural challenges that characterized every other species' entry into the galactic framework. They had simply said yes. Vel-Sareth had, at the time, taken that as evidence of their limited diplomatic sophistication. He was beginning to revise that interpretation. He crossed the floor of the Auric court slowly, aware that every eye in the chamber, and there were many, belonging to beings whose sensory architecture ranged from simple binocular vision to full electromagnetic spectrum awareness, was tracking him. He was the senior diplomatic liaison currently present. He was the one who would have to speak first. He stopped at a distance he calculated was non-threatening but authoritative and addressed the human in standard galactic, which she would certainly understand because it was a requirement for observer status. "You are Commander Riaya Solis," he said. "You are assigned to the Human Diplomatic Observation Mission aboard Hegemony Transit Station 4. The woman lowered her gaze from the ceiling and looked at him. Her eyes were dark, very still, and they held no performance of emotion, neither the appeasement Vel-Sareth associated with junior diplomatic personnel nor the careful blankness of experienced negotiators. They held something he struggled to categorize. "That's correct," she said. "This vessel," Vel-Sareth said, gesturing upward, "is inside a suppression field." "Yes," she said. He waited for more. She offered nothing further. "The suppression field," he said carefully, "prevents unauthorized entry into this space." "I know what it does," she said, and her tone was not disrespectful. It was simply accurate, as though she were confirming a shared fact rather than receiving instruction. Vel-Sareth became aware that his hearts, he had three, were beating in an uneven pattern. "Commander Solis, I am going to ask you a direct question, and I need you to understand that the answer you give will determine how the next several hours proceed for a very large number of beings." She nodded once slightly. "Go ahead. How did your vessel enter this space?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Ambassador, the more important question is how long it's been in here." The silence that followed was a different quality than the first silence. The first had been shock. This was the silence of 300 beings recalibrating. Vel-Sareth's secondary cognition was already running the calculations he did not want to run. If the ship had been present before the suppression field was activated for today's session, if it had been here during last week's session, if it had been here during the closed council review 3 months ago, during which the hegemony's internal security classification and the terms of the proposed human administrative cap had been discussed in detail. "How long?" he said, and his voice was considerably quieter than he intended. "That," Commander Solis said, and now something moved in her expression, not satisfaction, not triumph, something more complicated than either, "is what we need to talk about." Emperor Vosketh had not spoken since the ship uncloaked. He sat at the apex of the court's ceremonial tiering in a throne designed to communicate absolute spatial dominance, elevated, centered, with sightlines clear in every direction. And he had not moved, and he had not spoken, and the two things his advisors found most immediately alarming were that this was unusual, and that they did not understand why it was unusual. The emperor was not prone to fear. He was prone to the particular coldness of a being who had ruled for 4 decades and had long ago developed the ability to perceive threats and categorize them into manageable gradations. He categorized and he responded, and he maintained forward momentum. He had not responded. He was not maintaining forward momentum. He was looking at the human commander with an expression that none of his advisors could read, which was itself an event so rare that several of them were already composing emergency transmissions in their heads to their respective home civilization contacts. Because, when the emperor of the hegemony of consolidated races showed an expression his inner court couldn't interpret, the political implications were seismic. What none of them understood, what they had no framework to understand, was that Emperor Vosketh had, in the first 3 seconds after the human ship appeared, reached a conclusion that his advisors had not yet reached. He had reached it because he was, despite everything, an exceptionally intelligent being, and because he had made a career of identifying threats before his contemporaries did. He had realized that he had been operating for the past 11 years on an assumption he had never examined. He had assumed that when he was alone in this room, he was alone. Commander Riaya Solis had served in 4 different assignments over the previous decade. Vel Sareth would learn this later. He would also learn later that none of her previous assignments had any diplomatic component, and that her listed qualification for the observer mission was a single line in her service record that read, Cross-Disciplinary Field Adaptation. He would spend considerable time trying to determine what that meant. He would not arrive at a satisfying answer. What he would not learn, because it was not in any file that the hegemony had access to, was that she had volunteered for this assignment. That she had, in fact, specifically requested it 6 months before it was offered to her. That the request had been routed through 4 separate levels of human administrative structure, each of which had passed it upward with marginal annotations that amounted to a collective institutional shrug. She had been assigned because no one could think of a good reason not to assign her, and because she spoke 7 languages including 3 hegemony dialects that weren't taught in any diplomatic program, and because the senior officer who reviewed her file had written in the margin simply, "She'll figure it out." She had figured it out. "You've been listening," Vel Sareth said. He was still standing below the human ship, which continued to float in the upper air of the Auric court with a quietness that bothered him more the longer he looked at it. For how long? Long enough to understand what the hegemony intends to do with the administrative cap proposal, she said, and long enough to understand why you didn't share it with us in observer session. The administrative cap. Vel Sareth felt something cold move through him. The proposal had been in closed session. It had been classified at the highest hegemony security level. It outlined, in precise procedural language, a framework for limiting human population access to 60% of currently occupied territories, for restricting human ship registry to defensive class vessels only, and for inserting a hegemony oversight administrator into the governance structure of any human majority world with a population exceeding 200 million. It was not, the drafting committee had carefully documented, an aggressive action. It was an administrative measure, a structural adjustment, a response to what several senior council members had described as the accelerating complexity of managing an unquantified variable in an otherwise stable system. The unquantified variable was humanity. "How many of you know?" Vel Sareth asked. "About the cap proposal," she said. "About all of it, the sessions, the ship, what you've heard." She considered him with those very still eyes. "Ambassador," she said, "I need you to understand something. The way you just asked that question, the framework you're using to analyze this situation, it's going to keep giving you wrong answers." "Explain," he said, because there was very little else he could say. "You're trying to determine scope," she said. "You want to know if this is one person with one ship or a coordinated operation so you can calibrate your response. That's the right analytical instinct. But the question you're not asking is why we built a cloaking system that functions inside your suppression field at all. The question you're not asking is what it means that we built something specifically designed to be here, in this room, in this particular situation." She paused. "We didn't build it because we were planning to invade," she said. "We built it because we knew that eventually we would need to have a conversation that couldn't happen any other way. And we built it because we wanted to make sure when we had that conversation that we weren't the only ones who knew what the truth was." Vel Sareth stood very still. "We've been waiting," she said, "for the moment when the cap proposal moved from theoretical to procedural. That happened 9 days ago when it cleared the 3rd drafting committee and was assigned a ratification timeline. 9 days ago. Vel Sareth ran back through his own movements. 9 days ago, he had attended a closed senior staff briefing. 9 days ago, the Emperor had initialed the procedural authorization. 9 days ago, the document had moved from a possibility to a scheduled event. 9 days ago, something had changed and he hadn't known it. "What do you want?" he said. And she said very quietly, "That's a more complicated question than it sounds." The human ship had been inside the court for, it would later be determined, 47 days. The suppression field, according to all hegemony sensor data, had been continuously active for that entire period. The ship had entered before the field was activated for a routine session 7 weeks ago and had simply remained silent, cloaked, while the hegemony conducted its internal business around it. 47 days. 11 closed sessions, 4 security briefings, 2 classified council votes. The technical team that would spend the following weeks attempting to understand the cloaking mechanism would eventually produce a report that was heavily annotated with words like anomalous and inconsistent, and in one section written by the team's most senior analyst, a single sentence that read, "We cannot rule out that the suppression field was working correctly and that the human vessel was not, by whatever standard the field uses, actually there." This sentence would be quietly removed from the official report. It would not be forgotten. The more immediate question, the question that Vel Sareth was now managing in real time while 300 witnesses stood in silence around him, was what the humans wanted and what they intended to do with 47 days of classified hegemony intelligence. He had misunderstood the situation twice already. The first time when he assumed the ship's presence was a demonstration of aggression. The second time when he assumed the intelligence gathering was the primary operation. He was about to misunderstand it a third time. "The CAP proposal," Commander Solis said, "is based on a misreading of human behavior." "In what sense?" said a new voice, and Vel Sareth turned to see that Emperor Vosketh had descended from his elevated position and was walking across the floor of the Auric court toward them. This was extraordinary. The Emperor did not walk toward things. Things were arranged to come to him. Commander Solis turned to face him without visible surprise, which was its own remarkable thing, and Vel Sareth understood suddenly that she had expected this. She had expected the Emperor to come down. He filed that away. "The proposal," she said, addressing Vosketh directly with a directness that would have been diplomatically suicidal for any other observer representative, characterizes human expansion as a complexity variable. Something that increases administrative difficulty, something that needs to be contained and managed before it destabilizes your equilibrium. "Is that characterization inaccurate?" Vosketh said. "It's accurate," she said, "but it's incomplete in a way that makes the proposed solution dangerous." The Emperor studied her. Vel Sareth had served in his court for 12 years, and he had seen the Emperor study many things, many beings, many situations. He had never seen this exact quality of attention. This was not the Emperor assessing a problem. This was the Emperor assessing a phenomenon he could not yet classify. "Explain," Vosketh said. "The complexity you're trying to reduce," Solis said, "isn't a side effect of human expansion. It's the mechanism." Silence. "The hegemony has maintained stability for 600 years," she continued, "by reducing variables, standardizing governance frameworks, aligning species into predictable administrative categories. It works remarkably well. 43 civilizations, one coherent structure, minimum internal conflict. It's an extraordinary achievement." "And yet," the Emperor said. "And yet," she said, "every 30 to 40 years, a stability event occurs that your standardized frameworks cannot accommodate. An external pressure, a technology shift, an ecological collapse, a contact with something outside the hegemony's existing models. And every time, the hegemony loses 3 to 7 years of institutional momentum while the Council identifies which existing framework applies." Vel Sareth said nothing, because he was aware that she was describing something accurate. Something he had never heard articulated this way, but accurate. You reduce complexity to maintain stability, she said. But complexity is also the only thing that generates adaptive response to genuinely novel conditions. You are arguing, the Emperor said slowly, that humanity's unpredictability is a resource. I'm arguing, she said, that you built a system that is extraordinarily resistant to change, and that the universe changes anyway, and that what you're proposing to do is remove the only component of your system that adapts on short timescales. A long pause. Vel Sareth watched Vosketh's expression move through something he couldn't fully track, and then the Emperor said, "You believe you are indispensable." "No," she said. "I believe you're making a decision based on the assumption that the next 40 years will resemble the last 60, and I have 47 days of your internal security briefings that suggest you have more reasons to doubt that assumption than I do." The quality of silence that followed was the third kind Vel Sareth had experienced since the ship appeared. The first was shock. The second was recalibration. This was something he didn't have an immediate word for. It was the silence of a very old system encountering the possibility that its self-model had a flaw it couldn't internally identify. Emperor Vosketh turned away from her and walked back toward his throne. Then he stopped. He didn't turn around. He stood with his back to the court, and his voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only the nearest beings could hear it. "The ship," he said, "the cloaking technology, your government authorized this." "Yes," Solis said, "at significant cost. Yes. If this had been discovered before you chose to reveal it," he said, "the diplomatic consequences would have been severe. We know. And yet you built it, you placed it here. You waited 47 days. Yes." He turned then very slowly and looked at her. "Why?" Solis was quiet for a moment. Vel Sareth watched her, and for the first time since she had appeared in the court, he saw something shift in her face. Not weakness, not fear, something more honest than either. "Because 11 years ago," she said, "we accepted observer status. We sat in your gallery and we listened, and we did not speak because we were not permitted to speak. And we watched the hegemony make decisions about our territories, our shipping lanes, our governance structures, and we filed formal notations of concern through the approved channels, and those notations were acknowledged and archived, and nothing changed." She looked at him. "We tried the correct way," she said, "for 11 years. Something moved in Vosketh's expression. "The correct way," she said, "was not working, so we had to ask ourselves what we were willing to do." Vel Sareth found he had no immediate response to this. He was aware that his analytical framework was struggling. He had been operating on the assumption that the human ship, the cloaking technology, the 47 days of intelligence gathering represented an aggressive posture, a power play, a demonstration of capability designed to intimidate. He was beginning to understand that it was something stranger than that. It was evidence. The humans hadn't come here to threaten. They had come here to show the hegemony something it couldn't have believed without proof. They had spent. He would later try to calculate the resources and find the calculation uncomfortable. An extraordinary amount of their limited industrial and research capacity, developing a technology specifically designed to sit inside this room and do nothing. Not to gather intelligence for tactical advantage. Not to plant signals or compromise systems. Simply to exist, undetected for long enough that when it was revealed, the revelation itself would carry the weight of the thing they needed to say. "We were here. You didn't know we were here, but we knew, and we waited until there was something worth saying before we spoke." "What is it that you want?" Vel Sareth said again, and this time he heard his own voice asking the question differently than he had asked it before. Not the calculation of a diplomat assessing demands. Something closer to genuine confusion. "I want to make a proposal," Solis said, "to the Emperor formally, in this chamber, on record." "You do not have speaking rights in this chamber," Vel Sareth said reflexively. "No," she said, We have observer status. And then she looked at Vas Keth. But the Emperor can grant temporary speaking rights to any party by personal imperial decree. It's a provision that's been used 11 times in 600 years. Most recently 43 years ago. She had studied the law, of course she had. Vas Keth regarded her for a long moment. Then he returned to his throne. He sat. He was quiet for what felt to Vel Sareth like an unusually extended period, and he understood that the Emperor was not deliberating. He was making a calculation about something more complex than the immediate diplomatic situation. "Granted," the Emperor said at last. The murmur that moved through the court was unlike any Vel Sareth had heard in 12 years of service. It was not protest. It was the sound of 300 beings updating their models simultaneously. Commander Riaya Soli stood below the human warship, which continued to float in perfect stillness in the sacred air of the Auric court, unasked and inexplicable and present. And she did not appear to draw herself up or compose herself for a formal presentation. She simply spoke, in the same quiet voice she had used throughout, as though she were continuing a conversation rather than beginning one. "The hegemony's administrative cap proposal," she said, "goes to ratification in 16 days. Before that happens, I'm requesting a formal review period of 60 days, during which a joint human hegemony commission will assess the long-term structural implications of the proposal against a documented stability threat index." "What stability threat index?" Vel Sareth said. "The one we compiled," she said, "from 47 days of your internal briefings." Another silence, and then something unexpected. The sound of one of the beings in the upper tier of the court. Vel Sareth couldn't see who, making a sound that was, unmistakably, a suppressed vocalization of involuntary reaction. Not humor, something more complicated. The sound of a being encountering a situation so far outside expected parameters that the emotional processing had nowhere else to go. The humans had used the intelligence they gathered not to build a military threat assessment, not to identify hegemony vulnerabilities. They had used it to build an argument. "You used 47 days of classified security briefings," Vel Sareth said slowly, "to create a proposal to help us." "We used 47 days of classified security briefings," she said, "to make sure we understood the problem well enough to make a proposal worth hearing. And if we reject the proposal," she was quiet for a moment, "then we return to observer status and we continue filing formal notations of concern through the approved channels. Which," he said, "as you've noted, has not been effective." "No," she said, "but we'll keep doing it." Vel Sareth looked at her. He looked at the ship. He looked at the Emperor, who was watching Commander Solis with that unreadable expression that had not changed since the moment the cloak dropped. "Why?" Vel Sareth said, and he was aware that he was asking something that went beyond the diplomatic situation, that he was asking something he genuinely needed to understand. "Why keep trying? If the mechanisms don't work, if the formal channels don't work, if the approved processes produce no change, why continue?" She looked at him for a long time without speaking. When she did speak, it was quietly, and Vel Sareth had the strange impression that she was saying something she had thought about for a very long time, not rehearsed. The opposite, like something she had examined so often it had worn down to its simplest form. "Because we live here," she said. "This is our galaxy too. And we are not going to leave, and we are not going to stop. And we would rather spend a decade filing documents that no one reads than spend a decade doing nothing. We would rather build a technology that costs more than we can comfortably afford to prove a point that might not work than accept a situation that we believe is wrong." She paused. "You keep asking what we want. Ambassador, Your Majesty, that's what we want, to be heard. To actually be heard, not archived and acknowledged. We're not asking for control of the hegemony. We're not asking for dominance or special status or the dismantling of anything you've built. We built a ship that could sit invisibly in your most secure chamber for 47 days, and we used it to ask for a conversation. That's what we're like. The Emperor spoke. What threat, he said, is in your stability index? And Solis said, the one in the outer monitoring reports. Section 9 of the fourth quarter briefing from 12 weeks ago. The one your internal analysts flagged as requiring further study, and then the flag was deprioritized because the current council session had a full legislative calendar. The room was very still. Vel Sareth knew Section 9. He had read the fourth quarter briefing, the outer monitoring anomaly. A persistent low signal pattern in a region beyond the hegemony's explored frontier, consistent with the analyst had used careful language, organized movement on a large scale, in a direction that had no current explanation. It had been deprioritized because the council session had a full legislative calendar. You think it's significant, the Emperor said. I think it's the kind of thing, Solis said, that your existing frameworks will take 3 to 7 years to classify. And I think the timeline on Section 9 doesn't give you 3 to 7 years. And humans, Vosketh said, and now his voice had something in it that Vel Sareth had genuinely never heard before, can respond faster. We're already responding, she said, and something in the way she said it, something in the particular completeness of it, told Vel Sareth that this was the sentence she had come here to say. That everything else, the ship, the intelligence, the proposal, the 47 days had been the architecture built to make this one sentence carry the weight it needed to carry. We're already responding. Not, we can, not, we would be willing to, not, we request authorization. Already. Emperor Vosketh sat in his elevated throne in the Auric court of Throne Station Primarch and looked at the human commander standing below a warship that should not have been able to enter this space. He looked at her for a very long time, and then he said something that no one in the court expected, something that Vel Sareth would spend years afterward turning over in his mind, examining from different angles, trying to determine what it revealed about the being who said it. He said, "How many of your people are already out there?" And she said, "Enough." And she said it gently, not as a threat, not as a boast, with a kind of sorrow in it that Vel Sareth didn't understand immediately, and that he would not fully understand for a long time. The sorrow of someone who knows that the answer is simultaneously reassuring, and the source of the question that keeps her awake. Because enough is never certain. Because enough is always a calculation made by people who went anyway, before the calculation resolved. Because waiting for certainty would have meant waiting too long. Because humans had looked at Section 9 and done their own analysis, and reached their own conclusion and sent people, actual people, with names, with families, with the same animal fear that any being feels in unknown space, into a region beyond the frontier without waiting for hegemony authorization, because hegemony authorization would have taken too long. They hadn't asked for permission. They had gone. And Commander Riaya Solis was standing here, in this court, with this ship, with this intelligence, with this proposal, because the people who had gone needed the hegemony to understand what they'd gone toward, needed the hegemony to be ready. And the only way to make the hegemony ready, the only way that had any chance of actually working, was to stand in the most sacred chamber of its most powerful institution and refuse to be invisible anymore. Vel Sareth looked at the warship and understood in a way he had not understood 40 minutes ago what it was. It was not a weapon. It had never been a weapon. It was a door, held open, by people willing to stand in a doorway indefinitely, in full knowledge of what standing there cost, because on the other side of the door was something the galaxy needed to walk through together, and they were not willing to walk through it alone. The Joint Commission, the Emperor said finally. 60 days. Yes, she said, and your people in the outer region will continue their work, she said, and will share what they find. In exchange, she looked at him steadily, in exchange for a seat at the table, a real seat, speaking rights, voting rights on matters that affect human territories. Not partnership out of the goodness of your hearts, partnership because you have looked at Section 9 and made your own calculation about what we are walking toward, and you understand that 43 civilizations with stable, predictable governance frameworks are not, on their own, the right tool for whatever comes next. The Emperor was silent. Then, and if the Commission determines the cap proposal remains necessary in modified form, then we negotiate the modification, she said. Because we are not leaving, and we are not going to stop, and we would rather spend 40 years negotiating inside a structure we disagree with than spend 40 years watching from the gallery. Velsareth closed his eyes briefly. He thought about 11 years of formal notations of concern. He thought about 47 days of a ship floating invisible in the most secure room in the galaxy. He thought about the people in the outer region, already there, already responding to something the hegemony had deprioritized because of a full legislative calendar. He thought about the look on Solis's face when she said enough, the sorrow in it, and the steadiness in it, and the particular human quality of carrying both at the same time and continuing forward regardless. He thought about what it meant that humanity's primary exhibit of power, in this moment, in a room where they could have brought weapons, where they had proven they had the technology to be undetectable, where they held 47 days of classified intelligence as leverage, was a proposal, was an argument, was a request to be heard. He thought, what kind of species builds the capability to be invisible and then chooses to become visible, not because the visibility benefits them strategically, but because the conversation that follows is more important than the advantage they surrender. He thought, what do you do with a species like that? He thought, what do you do with a species that will file documents that no one reads and build technologies they can barely afford and send people into the dark and stand in the Emperor's court and ask, quietly, with a warship over their heads and a full hand of cards they are choosing not to play, to be heard? He looked at Commander Ria Solis. He said very quietly, were you frightened? She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, something real. Yes, she said, but you came. We always come, she said, and then after a moment, that's sort of the thing about us. The Auric court was very still. The human warship floated in the sacred air above them, visible now, real now, present in a space it had occupied invisibly for 47 days. 47 days during which the hegemony of consolidated races had made decisions, passed resolutions, held briefings, conducted the ordinary and extraordinary business of governing 43 civilizations, all while something waited, patient, silent, watching, not because it was gathering power, but because it was gathering understanding. Because it believed, against all evidence, against 11 years of being unheard, against the weight of an institution 6 centuries old and 43 civilizations strong, that understanding was worth gathering, that the conversation was worth having, that the door was worth holding open. Emperor Vosketh looked at the ship for a long time. Then he looked at Commander Ria Solis, who looked back at him with those very still eyes that held no triumph and no appeasement, only that complicated human quality of being afraid and present simultaneously. He said, finally, 60 days. And the most dangerous thing about that moment, the thing that would stay with Velsareth for the rest of his career, the thing he would try to explain to colleagues and successors and never quite find the right words for, was not that the Emperor had agreed. It was that every being in that chamber, from the most senior council member to the youngest administrative attaché, had understood in the same instant what the 60 days meant, had understood that the hegemony had just granted speaking rights to a species that had already demonstrated it would keep speaking regardless, had understood that the humans had not come here to win something. They had come here to stay. And somewhere beyond the hegemony's frontier, in the dark of uncharted space, In whatever was moving in the outer monitoring region that Section 9 had flagged and the Council had deprioritized, there were human beings already out there, already responding, already, without authorization, without partnership, without the safety of galactic institutional backing, doing the thing they had decided needed to be done. Not because they were the strongest, not because they were certain, not because they had calculated that success was probable, because they had decided the alternative was worse. And that, Vel Sareth finally understood, was what the galaxy had never found a framework for, what no administrative cap could contain or redirect or productively manage, not the technology, not the intelligence, not the warship in the Emperor's court. This, the particular human quality of looking at a thing that is too large and too uncertain and too costly and deciding, not that they can survive it, not that they will win, not that the odds are acceptable, simply deciding that they would rather be the ones who tried. The warship hung in the sacred air of the Auric court, uncloaked and unhurried, and it would remain there for the duration of the commission period, as Solis had quietly requested and the Emperor had quietly allowed, a reminder that the humans were here now, visible, speaking at the table. And somewhere out beyond the last edge of charted space, in the dark that no hegemony framework had yet classified, the ones who had already gone looked outward at whatever was coming and made the same calculation their kind had always made. Not can we, not should we, only, someone has to.